So welcome to our 2022 talk on the adrenal glands. This year, I wanted to include an interesting conversation about how chronic viruses, especially COVID-19, affect the adrenal glands, as well as the nervous system as a whole and the vagus nerve. And so I think that'll make more sense as we go through. And I'm going to make this full screen. Okay, so moving everybody's faces, here we go. So the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys, and we're going to get into the anatomy in just a minute. But this talk today is basically just about the vagus nerve, which also controls our nervous system and our ability to switch between what we typically call fight or flight and rest and digest. So I know to a lot of you, you're very familiar with these terms, but if you're not, just pay attention. The next few slides, I think, explain all the basics. The COVID pandemic has definitely put an additional stressor on top of a society that was already feeling very stressed. And by stressed, I mean, we already did not have a lot of reserves when it comes to rest and digest. We were living in fight or flight, and then a pandemic came, right? Which made it even worse. So the good news is some of us can no longer ignore some of the symptoms we were able to ignore before. And the bad news is some of us are really in a tough spot. And I will tell you, I kind of left my personal journey for the end. I will tell you a little bit more about how I got into diving into and learning about the adrenal glands. But it really was the beginning of my functional medicine journey. And I'm actually grateful looking back. Because in 2015, I had this episode, and that really propelled me to read more about what was going on with my own cortisol, which is my stress hormone, right? So we're also going to talk about systemic inflammation in general, but also how viruses cause systemic inflammation, and then what we can do to heal. And that's why I want to make sure we leave at least 20 minutes to talk about what we can do to heal. I think you all know me, but my name's Kate Godley. And this clinic, the Functional Medicine Center, we actually have 3 providers here now. Kristen Timpey is our nurse practitioner, and Josh Corwin is a PA like me, and he does regenerative medicine. So if you need PRP or IV ozone, that's what he's there for. And then, of course, we have Kelly Price, who's on the call right now, who's our wellness coach. And then our team has grown in the last year. So Lauren Light, many of you know, is our office manager. And then Jessica Cox is our medical assistant. So if you haven't met all those people, you will soon. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the physical anatomy. Where is the brain? Where's the vagus nerve? How are these connected to the gut or the intestines? What is this hormone signaling? Cortisol is our main stress hormone. We're going to talk about how that opposes melatonin, which is our main sleep hormone, and then how they interact with adrenaline, which is more of a short-acting hormone. Chronic viruses like COVID, when it says EBV, that stands for Epstein-Barr virus. And then HSV 1 and 2 is herpes simplex virus 1 and 2. I would bet a lot of money that of everybody on the call, we all have at least one of these viruses in our blood, because Epstein-Barr and herpes simplex virus are so prevalent in our community. And then on top of that, most of our patients in the last 2 years have gotten COVID. So probably a lot of us even have all 3, which is very interesting. And it's really a synergistic effect sometimes, how this inflammation affects our nervous system. And then we're going to talk about the vagal tone and something called HRV, which is heart rate variability. And this has to do with how we can turn on and turn off our fight or flight and our rest and digest. And again, vitamins and herbs that heal, a summary of things that you can do for free. In general, lifestyle recommendations are free, which is wonderful. And then additional resources, because something I want to point out as we go through is that the way we perceive our stress is very important, and our perception of our stress can change how our body's able to heal or not heal. Okay, we know that inflammation is the root of all chronic disease. Acute inflammation is great. For example, if you get a paper cut, you want something to clot right away so it stops bleeding. That's acute inflammation. A simplistic view, but that's an example. Another example would be when you get a fever. When you have inflammation because you have a short term, like a stomach bug that lasts 24 hours, you get a fever and your immune system is now being flagged. Go ahead and fight this virus. But 3 days later, things calm down, or 5 days later, things calm down. The issue comes when we have inflammation for many, many years without having a break. A lot of what we talk about with the nervous system and with the immune system is all about balance. And so if we lose our balance, then that's when we get into trouble. Long-term inflammation, I kind of already said that. It definitely creates some symptoms of fatigue, of brain fog, hormone imbalances, can even create autoimmune disease or cancers. And food is our most powerful tool. Why do I say that? Well, a lot of people come in and they ask me for things they can do, but then I give them like 8 supplements or more. And they say, well, I really don't want to take supplements. Aren't there things we can do without supplements? And the truth is, yes. But then we have to look at your food and what you're eating, because your food is your medicine, right? So one key, if you want to take less supplements, is pay a little bit more careful attention to your food. And again, it's all about balance. Sometimes we have times, even myself, even though I'm giving you guys this advice, I have times when I'm able to pay more attention to my food and other times when I'm paying more attention to my sleep hygiene. So that's the next thing on the list. Sleep hygiene is everything surrounding our sleep, the timing of it, how warm it is in the room. So we're going to talk about some tips there. And then how can we move but not over exercise? This is huge because a lot of us are over exercising and that's actually stressing out the system even more. We have low reserves when it comes to cortisol, and then we over exercise and we really burn out those reserves. There's a book called Younger You by Kara Fitzgerald. I think it came out last year. It's really great. A lot of the things that I want to say in this presentation are in that book, but I can't possibly fit them all in to the 45 minutes. So if you want a little bit more info, grab that book. Okay, a couple definitions. The vagus nerve is the largest nerve in the body, and it's actually 2 nerves. It runs from the base of the skull, kind of behind the tongue in the middle of the brain, down to the pelvic floor. Okay, so there are 2 branches of it, but it affects everything. It can connect to the heart, connect to the swallowing. It can control the diaphragm. The vagus nerve can control the digestion, can control orgasm. So it's literally affecting everything from in the core of your body, right? And it is often the nerve that we, in the last few years, has gotten more popular. We talk about it a lot now because it was kind of ignored in the past. The parasympathetic nervous system is our rest and digest. So this is our calming nervous system. And it needs to be in balance with our sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight or freeze. So it's not that we necessarily are in 100% rest and digest or 100% fight or flight. It's more of a continuum, which we're going to talk about in a few moments. And we need to have some balance here. Ideally, though, we would spend about 80% of our energy in parasympathetic, and 20% of our day would be in our sympathetic. This includes sleep, though. During the deep sleep, we are in parasympathetic. During REM, we are a little bit in sympathetic. That's when we see our heart rate come up. So I'm pointing this out because I think a lot of us are kind of switched. We're spending more like 80% of our day in our sympathetic nervous system. Maybe that's because we hate our job. Maybe that's because we have issues going on at home where we don't feel safe or we don't feel safe in our body. And so I think starting to ask questions, if you don't feel safe or you feel miserable or stressed, asking why, and then trying to figure out what we can do about it. You know, sometimes it's just baby steps that make a big difference. And then adrenal dysfunction. This is typically, well, we used to call this adrenal fatigue, but we don't anymore. It's basically an imbalance within the gland, the adrenal gland. And interestingly, the vagus nerve innervates all of the organs except the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is not getting a direct nerve impulse from anywhere. It is actually sort of acting on its own, which is why it's really important that we look at the adrenal glands. And there's two of them, and the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys. I can pause for a second, just see. Okay, awesome. So again, here's the parasympathetic nervous system. Over here on the right is what it does. It can have different effects depending on the organ, right? So it will stimulate saliva so we can digest better, but it will actually slow down our heartbeat. So it's shunting blood towards the digestion system, the GI system, but it also contracts the bladder, which I find interesting. So you're able to urinate. So it's like the functions that you would need to nourish yourself and to thrive. That's what's happening here. The sympathetic is the opposite. It inhibits the bladder. So in other words, if you're sprinting, you're not going to accidentally pee typically, unless you have severe pelvic floor dysfunction, which we can talk about. But when you're in that fight or flight, you're not going to be able to calm down enough to urinate right then. Dilates your pupils so you can actually see better, especially in a dark alley if someone's chasing you. So these are all of the signs of stress, right? Signs, and we can have these because of a psychological or a physical stressor. And then I also wanted to mention here secretion of adrenaline and noradrenaline. So adrenaline is our short-acting stress hormone, and it does help perpetuate all of these things. Okay, I talked about a lot of this already, but I wanted to mention that hydrocortisone is a prescription medication that is structurally the same as cortisol. So you can give someone hydrocortisone if they're not making any cortisol anymore, something called addisons. Made in the cortex of the adrenal glands is where cortisol is made. It has to be in balance with DHEA, estrogen or estradiol, testosterone, and progesterone. When I think of these hormones, I think of DHEA as being kind of a youthful hormone, keeps us younger, but it needs to be in balance with cortisol. If we have too much DHEA and not enough cortisol, we can actually have acne. Estrogen is, if it's too low, we can have symptoms of dryness, especially mucosal dryness for women. Estrogen that's too high or much higher than our cortisol or our testosterone can cause like emotionally labile. So people will cry easily. I think we all know a little bit about testosterone, but testosterone is also the number one thing I find to be low when people have ADHD. So if you have attention deficit disorder, it's good to get your testosterone level also tested. And progesterone to me is like our sleepy hormone. This is our feel-good anti-anxiety hormone, but it definitely helps us sleep. So these are things we can measure in the blood or in saliva. We know that cortisol must counter melatonin. So first thing in the morning is when we want our cortisol to be the highest, and that's when we want our melatonin to be the lowest. If you have a hard time waking up in the morning, if it takes you an hour or two, it might be helpful to do a first morning cortisol test. Same thing with if you can't sleep at night, it can also be helpful to test at night. It can stay elevated for many years, however. If cortisol is elevated for many years, because remember, we need some cortisol, but if it's elevated for many years, it can cause immunosuppression, weight gain, can also eventually burn out where the adrenal glands are not able to secrete enough cortisol, and then it causes low blood pressure. And I often see this as low sodium as well, and that's because of another hormone called aldosterone. Most patients with low cortisol also have low aldosterone, which it's not really important that we get into that right now, but I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about what this hormone does. It doesn't always follow the same course. So some patients start where their childhood's very stressful and they have very high cortisol in their childhood. And then by age 20, 25, it's actually getting low. But not everybody. Some people also have elevated cortisol later in life. And it doesn't necessarily come before or after having low cortisol. They just have elevated cortisol by itself. But there is a good range, and you want to make sure you're in the healthy range. I'm going to skip this one real quick because the next slide's the same thing, and I think it's a little bit better. So here's the brain. And we know that the hypothalamus, which is inside the brain, is actually sending a signal using this hormone to the pituitary gland, which is in the center of the brain. They're very close to each other in the brain. And then the pituitary gland sends this signal to the adrenal gland to make cortisol. All of this happens pretty quickly, especially if there is adrenaline present. So if there's a stressor, somebody jumps out of a closet and scares you, this happens pretty quickly. But I wanted to point out that this is a feedback mechanism, and the hypothalamus should also begin to decrease the signal when the stressor goes away. The problem is a lot of us, we don't react to a stressor quickly, but we also don't recover quickly. So this mechanism is not working correctly. And that's because the feedback is not working correctly. So with hormones, there's always going to be a feedback. As soon as there's elevated amounts of cortisol in the blood, this should be telling the hypothalamus to stop sending this signal to the pituitary. This is another way of looking at it, but the same thing, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, we call it. As soon as there's elevated cortisol, we should be telling the brain, the blood should be signaling to the brain, slow down this train here. We don't need any more cortisol. However, what happens is there's continual psychological and or physical stress. And so because the stress keeps coming into the brain, then the cortisol is continued to be released. Eventually, though, you do run out of the cofactors that you need to make the cortisol. Okay, these were just a few slides kind of talking about connections. I'm not going to go through and read this one line by line, but the bottom line is thyroid symptoms and adrenal symptoms mimic each other. So if you think you have low functioning thyroid, you may instead have low functioning adrenal glands. You also could have both, right? So when I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's, I actually also had hypocortisolism. Not that it was tested at the time, because a lot of providers, like conventional providers, are not testing it. We know that we need certain nutrients to continue to make our cortisol. We need salt, we need vitamin C, and we need B vitamins, and also PC is phosphatidylcholine to help build the mitochondria of the cell. So I'm not going to get into too much more here, but know that this chapter of this book, Stop the Thyroid Menace, I can send that out to people. I have scanned the chapter if you'd like to read more about how the thyroid and the adrenals are connected. Lastly, there's definitely a connection with the gut and the brain. So when we have more of the beneficial bacteria in the gut that signal to the brain to make more happy hormones, then the system is in balance. However, things like hand sanitizers, stress because it lowers our hydrochloric acid in the stomach, antibiotics, glyphosates and pesticides, they kill the bacteria in the gut that we need, the gut microbiota, as it says here in this last line, that basically would tell the brain, okay, now you're out of fight or flight. So the problem here is we can address everything else, but if we forget about the bacteria in the gut, then we're missing a big chunk of what we need to heal the nervous system, heal the adrenal glands, heal the vagus nerve. So I'm using a lot of those words interchangeably because the nervous system, part of that is the vagus nerve and part of that is the adrenal glands and part of that is the brain as well. There's a lot of new exciting research in the last 10 years on the gut-brain connection. We know healthy fats are really, really important here. Omega-3s not only heal the gut, but they also heal the brain. People that have leaky gut often also have leaky brain. There's quite a few articles on this. If you want more information, I can send you more. Bottom line is, I just said in the last 2 minutes, I said we need salt. Salt's good for us, and we need fat. And those are two things that for many, many, many years in the conventional medicine community, we cut down on fat and we cut down on salt, and we were doing ourselves a disservice. We were setting ourselves up to need more pharmaceuticals, which is not what we in general want, right? Kelly, you want to unmute because you're laughing?
Well, I was just laughing because I saw someone say, yay, salt and fat. And I think it's important to, because yay, salt and fat is flavor, but it's also important to think about the sources of these foods, right? So we're talking about avocados, olive oil, flax seeds, fish. We're talking about pink Himalayan sea salt, right? Not potato chips. So so yay, salt and fat, but source is important.
Yeah, we made our own sweet potato fries the other day with avocado oil. And I was thinking about the fact that it's often the oils they're choosing, right? Because they're like pro-inflammatory oils when you go get a bag of potato chips. So we are going to talk more about that Friday when we start we're not calling it that, the rest and reset food detox on Friday. So if you want to talk more about healthy fats and healthy salts, then join us on Friday for sure. So
laughing at me.
Yeah. Kelly, it's awesome if you keep watching the chat. That way, if anything important comes up, you can unmute too. So the next thing I was going to mention is just, we know that elevated cortisol, again, it's our stress hormone, it increases our blood glucose. That is perfectly fine when it's 2 days of I have to get through childbirth, right? But not so great when it's 20 years. So we often have elevated fasting blood glucose when our cortisol is staying elevated. It also suppresses our antibody formation. Why would the body do this? Well, you don't need to make antibodies to infections if you're literally trying to run away from a saber-toothed tiger that's going to eat you. In other words, it's only giving blood flow and resources to the area of the body that's the most important at that time. And if you're in a physical stressful situation, then making antibodies to some infection that'll kill you in 10 days is not important, right? It's only about right now. And that is a problem when this goes on for many, many years. It also means that if you decided to get a shot or a jab for the COVID vaccine, then you may not have made enough antibodies. But this is something we can test. So we can test antibodies to multiple different vaccines as well as former infections. So I wanted to point that out. We know that T cells, which are the other part of the immune system that's also important, it causes them to die. Elevated cortisol kills T cells. And this is actually how steroids work. So if you've ever taken prednisone, because of having an asthma attack or having bronchitis, yes, the inflammation is suppressed, but the concern is that you're losing the ability to fight certain infections, the ones that are intracellular, like Epstein-Barr. Okay, and then we also, with elevated cortisol, it does eventually cause an increase in the amount of fat that we carry, and it breaks down muscle. So you never want a hormone to stick around for a long time that increases your fat and breaks down your muscle. It's totally fine if it's there for 10 minutes elevated, but not forever. It enhances the activity of adrenaline, which I think we already knew. And I already mentioned it does shunt blood from digestion and from the parasympathetic to the fight or flight. This is another example of how steroids work. If people take prednisone for infection, sometimes they have insomnia, right? And that's what's happening there. Elevated cortisol over many years also creates poor quality sleep, which we're going to get to in just a minute. I don't want to spend too much longer here. Okay, there is an article. This is a really good article at the bottom, and I'll send out the links in the chat. Or Kelly, if you can pull them from my email, that would be great. This article talks about specifically how these viruses affect the immune system. And I wanted to point out that SARS or COVID, SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV-19 virus also affects the adrenals through elevated cytokine levels. It creates a systemic inflammatory response. So what happens is the virus itself elevates things called cytokines. Inflammatory cytokines are just messengers, but they're similar to hormones. So they go to every single spot in the body and they say, okay, everybody, do what you do if there's inflammation. The problem is a lot of us already had that happening because we had Epstein-Barr or HSV-1 or another chronic infection like Lyme disease. And then when we get COVID, we have a much harder time calming down all of the inflammation. Okay, there are also certain viruses, and we think COVID may do this. It can trigger an autoimmune destruction of the adrenal gland. So the body itself actually destroys the adrenal gland. Not good. And I think that's all I'm going to mention on there, but feel free to look at that article if you want to know a little bit more. This is a typical course of COVID. Here's day 1 of the illness. Here's day 5. And if you look up here, this is the viral replication. Around day 5 is when the virus is replicating the most quickly, which means you have the most virus in your blood, in the mucous membranes. By day 7, 8, 9, the viral replication has gone down, but you start to have increased inflammation. And this is why I actually said to quite a few people when I talked to you guys, when everybody kind of got it December, January, I said, please let me know by day 8 if you're starting to feel worse again. If you're starting to feel worse on day 8, then I know that's not the virus itself, that's actually your body increasing inflammation. We can measure specific blood markers, D-dimer, CRP, and histamine levels to see if that's happening. D-dimer increases your risk of clotting. CRP can increase your risk of heart attack or stroke. So really important to just tell people that you care about. Remember, COVID is not the initial infection that's really causing the problem. It's the delayed inflammation that's causing the problem. Okay, and then this was also a graph I took right from that article that really talks about specific viruses. So over here are examples, and this talks about how they actually damage the pituitary gland, which was that part of the brain that is involved in the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis or conversation that's going on. There are definitely other viruses. I often check people for Coxsackie's, especially if they're having like chronic fatigue. No influenzas here. Oops, sorry. But my point is there's a lot of other viruses that we already had in our body and then we're exposed to COVID. And that's what, it's kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. Okay. I want to talk a little bit now about what we can do, right? Because it's great to have this information, but really it's kind of depressing unless we know exactly what to do. So we know that when we're exposed to any pathogen, but especially something like a virus, if our inflammation starts with a baseline of low, and we have a balance of our cortisol and our estrogen, a balance of our DHEA and our cortisol. If everything is in balance, we're going to have the best reserves, and our immune system is most likely to behave the way we want it to and calm down quickly after the virus is cleared. So that's number 1, is just do the best we can with all of our functional medicine tenants to try to get our inflammation down. How can we do that? Quality of sleep is really important. Some of us are able to sleep 10 hours, but we wake up not feeling rested. I ask people to use an app like Sleep Cycle or get an Oura ring, O-U-R-A, to see if you're getting any deep sleep. I like to see people getting at least 2 hours of deep sleep a night. Most of the time when we start tracking, people are getting under an hour of deep sleep a night, which means we're not in that parasympathetic rest and digest. Quality of our food is also important. When I go to the farmer's market on Saturday, they've picked the vegetables that I buy the day before. They also didn't let them sit under that like mister thing that's in the grocery store that has water that's also filled with glyphosates. So the vegetables that I'm getting have been picked more recently, and they're not covered in any sort of like water or mist that also has chemicals in it. They're also not wrapped in plastic. So 3 benefits of going to the farmer's market to get your food. It also kind of encourages you to eat more in season with the way that our body's supposed to eat, more cooked vegetables in the winter, maybe a little bit more raw in the summer if our gut's ready. Lower our stress. And here's the problem. We are not always aware of our stressors. I'll give you a personal example. Last August, yeah, I'm getting, the years have been mushed together since COVID started, but 2021, when Durham said they weren't going to open school, no, so it was the previous August. Anyway, when Durham Public School said they weren't going to open school, I said, it's fine. We'll just continue to homeschool. You know, Josh and I will keep working crazy hours and we'll keep homeschooling and it'll be fine. And then the next month I had a huge autoimmune flare, and my acupuncturist said, why are you in denial? that the school not opening stressed you out. But it took somebody close to me to notice, because I think what I thought was, if I say that out loud, then I'll sound like I'm complaining, right? So that has to do with the way I was raised and some of the things that were pushed upon me as a young kid. But my point is, I didn't even realize that that was causing a stress until I had an autoimmune flare and I couldn't swallow because I have something called CREST syndrome. So I think this is where a therapist helps, a good friend, a partner that you can talk to. Journaling can be huge. Bruce Lipton has a book called The Biology of Our Belief, and it does a really good job of explaining it's not the event, it's also the way we look at it. Right. My yoga teacher, Ashley Nunn, also has some free resources I'm going to send to you. Every few months, she does something called a compassion training, and she teaches you about basically what the Buddha said about stress and how we all are going to suffer, and we make our suffering worse because we create a story around our emotions instead of feeling the emotion and moving forward. So I recommend you try that book, and then also, join my teacher's compassion training class. It's a really interesting Zoom online group. And okay, the next thing I wanted to talk about was just how do we during the day activate rest and digest. So, more and more, I'm not really seeing people stop and pray before they eat. You don't have to pray to anybody, but I think if we all stopped and took a deep breath before we ate our food, it would be awesome, because it's really hard to digest our food. First of all, we can't digest while we're driving, so we can't eat while we're driving. We also can't digest while we're working and checking emails or on our phone reading about what's happening, in Ukraine. Like, that's not going to happen. We're not going to digest. So working on that, working on taking a deep breath before we eat, focusing on how does the food smell? How does it look? Just slowing down for just a minute. 1 minute or 60 seconds can actually make a huge difference. Try to heal the adrenal gland from prior insults. Sometimes this looks like focusing on sleep hygiene. Sometimes it's like EMDR or like really deep therapy that you need to go do from previous trauma. Remember, the gut, the brain hormones, and the sex hormones are all communicating. So the tricky part is, you may have low estrogen and think it's not affecting anything else, but it is. It's actually affecting your histamines and it's affecting your cortisol. So if you have questions about some of that and you're not sure if it's connected, feel free to ask me. But usually the answer is yes. If you think something's connected in the body, it is connected. This slide, I just wanted to talk about our tone. We've already talked a little bit about this, but this is a continuum with our vagus nerve. Over here on the left, we have our fight or flight. This is when we're yelling, we're short-tempered, we're more defensive when we are talking to people around us. This is when we can run really fast. And then over here is our rest and digest, our deep sleep. If you find the beach relaxing, if you can imagine just closing your eyes and listening to the waves and just being in a deep state of relaxation. Maybe for you, it's the mountains. But my point is, I think we need to pay a little bit more attention to how often we are in this area, and maybe just bring it back towards the middle. So if I sit down and I count my breaths and I check my pulse, and that just takes me 30 seconds, I can tell you, oh, I'm more in this fight or flight, or I'm more in this rest and digest. In general, a resting pulse between 40 and 70 would be more in the rest and digest. And then anything over that would be more fight or flight, but that depends on the person and other things. But just finding little ways to check in with yourself can make a huge difference throughout your day. We know that we need vitamin C. The vitamin C is interesting. The body doesn't make it. It's one of the few vitamins that we can't put together from other things. So you have to either eat it or take it in a pill. Most of us, especially if you've had Epstein-Barr, you need at least 2 grams a day of vitamin C. Sometimes that causes an upset stomach. We can also do IV vitamin C, or you can just focus on eating berries and eating healthy foods. Vitamin Bs, these are our leafy greens, and also liver organ meats. Most of us need methylfolate and methylcobalamin. If you read your B vitamin and it has cyanocobalamin or folic acid, then that's probably because they wanted to save money and use cheap ingredients. But it's not the best for you. And this is because I have now tested probably 120 of our patients, and I think only 1 out of 120 does not have an MTHFR mutation. So this has to do with that darn MTHFR mutation, which most of us have, especially if you're prone to more adrenal dysfunction. Salt, we know we need sodium, potassium, magnesium. Now, this doesn't mean processed foods and fast foods, which are very high in sodium. It's more healthy sodium. A lot of times when we start to eat healthy, we do something like Whole30, we feel a little bit dizzy. And that's because we've gone from eating like fast food and processed food to eating very clean in a matter of just a day. And it's dropped our sodium intake very low. So be careful with that. And this is why Kelly and I are here. If you send us your 7-day food log, we can actually help add up how much sodium you're getting. Magnesium, hugely important. It's involved in all detox reactions, helps us feel calm, helps us sleep better. Magnesium, there are all different formulations. I do not prefer one over the other, but I like trimag or triple magnesium or combinations. Neuromag is great. Magnesium aspartate is great for people with low testosterone. But if you have questions about magnesium, let us know at your individual session. Lithium is also something that is in our tap water, but if we're not drinking tap water for good reasons, like pesticides or heavy metals, and we're filtering it, then we may not be getting enough lithium. We typically need, it's a micronutrient like copper, where we need tiny amounts. Some people can start by taking lithium orotate 5 milligrams a day and they feel great. Some people only need 1 milligram. So you can start and see how you feel, but a lot of times that is a mineral that we need to replace. And it allows us to access meditation or access our healing hormones more quickly. So that's the thing about lithium is if you don't have it, you feel a little bit like you can't explain it, but there's some anxiety and it's not really coming from you. It's coming from somewhere else. And lithium helps a lot with anxiety or like racing thoughts as well. And then phosphatidylserine in general lowers our cortisol, but it does help us sleep and it helps us recover from exercise. We should be able to make it, but a lot of us are not, and a lot of us are not eating enough of it. So it's better to just take a supplement if you need it. And then phosphatidylcholine, I already mentioned, but mitochondria make up a lot of the adrenal gland itself. Inside the cells is the mitochondria, and they're supposed to be making the hormones. So if the mitochondria are damaged because you don't have enough of the phosphatidylcholine or of the B vitamins, then it's going to be difficult for you to make your hormones. A lot of patients with PMS or irregular periods, women, if they take B vitamins, that helps a lot too. Vitamin D. Vitamin D is really helpful because it's probably more of a hormone than it is a vitamin. A lot of us have been depleted of vitamin D. Sometimes that's from mold exposure. Sometimes that's because genetically we're more prone to autoimmune. But for whatever reason, if your vitamin D is very low, you definitely need it to get better quality sleep. A lot of times when people are sleeping for 8-10 hours, but they don't feel rested when they wake up, if they take vitamin D and get their level up, then they wake up rested. So ideally level would be around 80 in order to correctly fight COVID. Most of the time when I check people, their vitamin D is less than 30. So we've got some work to do there. Let me just see if there's anything important here. Oh, yes, I have to look up the foods. I'm forgetting the foods with phosphatidylcholine. Oh, I know eggs have choline, but some of us can't eat eggs. And with the phosphatidylcholine, it's more milligrams than it is IUs. Okay, we'll come back to those at the end. Oops, I didn't mean to skip that slide. Let me go back. Okay, so yeah, I think it makes sense that lowering our caffeine would take us out of fight or flight. I don't think I need to talk about that anymore. But lower or avoid alcohol will also help. It can make you sleepy and you fall asleep more quickly, but it actually prevents you from getting into deep sleep. So if you're going to have a glass of wine, could you do it before dinner instead of after? That is my ask. Also, organic would be great instead of having the pesticide laden wine. I know I made it sound delicious. Okay. And then avoid pro-inflammatory foods, added chemicals. Unfortunately, these are the list of the top 4 inflammatory foods: dairy, gluten, soy, and corn. We're going to talk more about this Friday, as well as this mantra, which is eat food, not too much, mostly vegetables. I think intermittent fasting can help a lot of people detox, and it gives our body a chance to sort of calm down, regulate blood sugar, regulate hormones. However, for women, they should not do extreme fasting during the luteal phase of their cycle. So let me know if you would like more information on that. And then we all need to drink some more water. If you weigh 160 pounds, you should drink about 80 ounces of water a day. Add more if you sweat. So interestingly, that book by Kara Fitzgerald, one of the first pages, the intro, she has a page that says ways to live longer and healthier, and cuddles is number 1. And I thought that was awesome because her point, and she's a very scientific writer, her point is when we measure people's hormones, if they've had some physical touch in the day, wanted physical touch like cuddles, then their hormones are much more balanced. So that's a free thing we can do, most people. You might have to convince your partner to get out of fight or flight first, but and then meditation, which, I think that word is heavy. I think it makes a lot of people scared. But if you haven't tried Kelly's Wednesday morning meditation, it is literally just stop long enough to notice your breath. She is there with you, reminding you to come back to your breath. It's a really awesome free thing we have going on here. It's included with your membership. We'll post more info at the end if anyone's not aware of how to get on there. But meditation can also be moving. So when I started meditation, it intimidated me, and I would just walk. And as I walked, I would count 4 steps. I would inhale, 4 steps, I would exhale, 4 steps, I would inhale. And I think that's because my brain likes to go, and it was just a lot easier. So it doesn't have to be sitting, but something where you notice if you're breathing. Walking, like I said, you can walk and look at the trees, or you can actually notice your breath. Mindfulness in general, if we are able to slow down and notice what we're doing and stop multitasking, we are going to calm down those hormones. And it's kind of nice because you actually have more power over that than you think. And it's a great way of not having to take a pill. Now, it does take time, right? Because a lot of what we're trying to undo didn't start overnight. It started a long time ago. And maybe we never had a good example in our lives of mindfulness to begin with. And then sleep hygiene, which I have a handout I can give you at the end if anybody wants the full handout and they haven't gotten it. And I have a couple more slides on sleep, but we really need to make sure the room is cool enough. There's no EMFs in the room, or if there's EMFs, they're minimal. Make sure that it's dark. So we need blackout curtains typically. And then we need to turn off the screen, which is kind of ironic as we're doing this on Zoom, but a lot of us turn the screen back on after the sun sets, and I am asking you to try maybe once or twice a week, keep the screen off after the sun sets and just notice how you feel, because you may feel a lot better. Okay, sleep. We know that we get more REM or dream sleep, active sleep in the early AM, like 4 to 7 AM, even 2 to 7 AM. And we get more deep sleep from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. So what happens if I go to bed at 12:30, but I've skipped this time from 10 p.m. to 12:30? I actually get a lot less deep sleep, right? So I understand that some people have different work schedules, but sometimes our sleep schedule is sabotaging us. So be careful, because if you skip the 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. section of sleep or part of it, you're not going to be able to get as much deep sleep, which is what we need for the rest and digest. It resets the circadian rhythm of the gut. And it also, I'll show you in a minute, resets our cortisol. Okay, can use HeartMap is another app that I like for HRV. And you can also use Sleep Cycle, which is an app. Sleep Cycle is free for the first week, and then you have to pay for it after that. Okay, cool room. It needs to be dark. We need to do things in the same order. Try to eat 3 to 4 hours instead of eating dinner at like 8 p.m. and going to bed at 9. That's not so helpful, because your stomach is sending certain hormones to your body to make more energy when you're digesting. And so we want to wait a little bit. or eat dinner earlier would be the best thing. A grounding pad can be great if you're sensitive to EMFs. If you don't know what that means, there is a website, emftracings.org. He is a local inspector who will actually come walk through your house and tell you if it's been electrically grounded, if it's been wired correctly, and if you can turn off your Wi-Fi. But he'll tell you actually EMF ratings in your bedroom. So if you're having trouble sleeping, consider that. If you're snoring, mouth breathing, or grinding, try to address these quickly. I already said magnesium. Try to get a full spectrum of light in your eyes in the morning. So if you could walk outside without sunglasses on or glasses on, that would be helpful because that tells your melatonin to turn off and that allows your cortisol to rise in the morning. When we wear sunglasses, we block it. When we're in the car, there's a UV coating on the window that actually blocks the full wavelength of sun. And then earlier bedtime. Most of us could afford to get in bed like 30 minutes earlier. Doesn't have to be drastic in the beginning, but try 30 minutes. And then we know that heart rate variability, which is HRV, predicts longevity. So there's another book at the end I'm going to show you. It's actually this one. It's called Activate Your Vagus Nerve. And this one also talks a lot about heart rate variability. The lower our resting pulse, the more variability we can have between the beats. So in general, if you're able to test your resting pulse and it's coming down, that's a good sign. That means that you are healthier. We now can use this more accurately to predict risk of heart attack and stroke. It's better than LDL or cholesterol checks in terms of predicting heart attack and stroke. So yeah, I don't think I'm gonna, we already talked about how all of these systems are connected. Okay, some herbs. So I don't have doses here, but if you'd like to know personal doses, feel free to let me know and I can tell you if I think any of these are good for you. I did not put licorice on here. I meant to put licorice. And then Rachel, our herbalist, also has this adrenal support formula, and it also has Siberian ginseng, gotu kola, and licorice. So those are great. And all of these herbs, including reishi, which is a mushroom, help us with our rest and digest. But they are adaptogens, so they work with what we need. So if we need more cortisol in the morning, they help. If we need less at bedtime, they help. If we need more at 1 p.m., because that's when we're crashing, they help. Most of them you would take twice a day. Also, the liver is important, and Schisandra supports the liver and is an adaptogen. So it might be one that helps both. The liver is important because stress is a toxin to the liver. So every single month, if you're a woman, you have a cycle, you need to detox your stress just like you detox your estrogen every month in order to keep your cycle regular. And our liver can only handle so much at a time. So things like dandelion tea can also really help. Doing this food reset, which we're going to do for 14 days, also really helps. These are things that you would need to talk to a provider about, more aggressive or prescription strength ways to fix cortisol issues or nervous system imbalances. I do have a handout. This last thing is our detox from the spike protein. If you had a shot or you had COVID, ask me for that spike protein handout because there's a lot of ways in there to actually decrease the spike protein that's floating around in the bloodstream that's causing inflammation. Fennel tea is a really good example that actually decreases our spike protein. So if you like fennel, go for that one. If not, there's a whole list of other ideas on there. I don't tell people to take melatonin if they're having sleep issues initially until we've tried these and the vitamins first. But if you've already tried all that and you're not sleeping great, sometimes melatonin is a good way to go. And if your progesterone is low, that really helps. Okay. This is just basically saying cortisol awakening response. So in the morning, it goes high, and that's that green graph, the green dotted line. Our cortisol should go high in the morning and then get lower throughout the day. Now, it should not go to 0 at noon or 1 p.m., but it should come down. Sometimes we get really sleepy in the afternoon if it's plummeting too quickly. A lot of people have also flatlined, which means they don't have an elevation of their cortisol in the morning. This matters for autoimmune disease because the interesting fact here is that cortisol spiking in the morning sends a signal to the immune system to turn off autoantibodies. For example, during the night, we've made antibodies to the thyroid or to the gut or to gluten, but the spike in the cortisol tells the immune system restart and get rid of those autoantibodies. So if we have a functioning cortisol response from the adrenal glands, essentially we could prevent autoimmune disease. And I think that's really cool, not just for prevention, but also for my patients that already have been diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. We can go backwards and try to get them back to having this graph, and their autoimmune things may go into remission. What if you still feel drained, but you've tried everything else? Then we have to look to all these other things that stress out the nervous system and the immune system. Heavy metals, silver fillings in your teeth contain mercury, mold toxins, persistent infections that I didn't list before. Hepatitis C is often overlooked. We need to test everybody, especially baby boomers. Fungal infections like Candida marcans, which is something that can grow in your nose. Of course, Lyme disease. Rule out autoimmune disease and cancer. And then I think the individualized help, that's where it also is nice to find the type of psychological help that you need. Maybe you just need acupuncture right now, or maybe you need a therapist, but it depends on the person and where you are. There's also a couple of really good books I'm going to show you at the end that help with some of the psychological stressors. Okay, this is just my personal timeline. I think it's kind of fun if you want to do a timeline. Put down everything that could have possibly affected your stress hormones. Kelly just made a face. Yeah, I mean, anyone who's around 40 knows when we were kids, bullying wasn't like, what's the word? It wasn't watched over by the adults, like, right? So I was bullied, had a few childhood traumas, including, aunts with drug addiction that kind of left me. Inflammatory diet. I mean, we ate bread and cheese nonstop, and I react to dairy, but you don't know that when you're eating it 4 times a day, right? It's taken me till this year to even say that I may have a type A personality. And then the interesting thing with my timeline is between 2001 and 2005, this was the rapid insults one after the next. So I played college field hockey, my friend died, and then 9/11 happened within a couple of weeks. My grandmother was actually kidnapped. I was in some horrible relationships, 2 of them during this time. And then I also had Epstein-Barr and 6 mercury fillings. So you can imagine that between 2001 to 2005, I was hanging on and doing well because I was young. But what happened later when I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's, which was around 2012, was the result of everything that had happened during this time period. And there is typically a delay when we have back-to-back-to-back traumas and then later are diagnosed with something, right? But the good news is, so the thing I wanted to point out was I had to go to the ER in 2015 when I passed out because my cortisol was 0. I had no cortisol, I had no salt, I had very, very low blood pressure. It's one of those things where it confuses you because you go to the doctor and they say, oh, your blood pressure is great. It's 80, 85 over 50. Well, that's not actually great because you could pass out, right? So for me, this ER visit in 2015, when they scanned me and said, you actually don't have a brain tumor, that's what we thought was happening, but you don't have a brain tumor, that kind of kickstarted me into, I'd already been doing yoga, but I wasn't really living it. In other words, I could do yoga for an hour, but then be extremely stressed out the rest of the day. But this changed the way that I was able to meditate. It motivated me to eat better again. There was a lot going on because I had 2 little kids then, but it really propelled me because I realized that those people in the emergency room just wanted to get me out of there. They had no idea what to do with someone with adrenal dysfunction, right? So I needed to learn everything that I just taught you guys was what I learned, right? Okay. So these are the questions that we kind of started out today with. I'm hoping that you have some answers, but I see there's some questions. I'll scan the chat. And if you want to unmute, and it's already 12:57, but if you want to unmute, yeah, I was going to say we can spend 10 minutes if you guys have 10 minutes just answering questions.
And I wrote down all the questions that came up in chat, so I can just start kind of asking you, Kate, and then,
great.
yeah. Okay. All right. So the first question, just looking back at the top, was when you were talking about the parasympathetic nervous system and all these things that are kind of on autopilot. And the question was, and we can control all of these things that seem on autopilot. So the rest of the presentation may have sort of answered this question, but right, we do have some control over it.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have to recognize what we can control and what we can't, right? So there's a bunch of construction behind my house right now, and the dog is barking. Well, I can't control the fact that there's construction and the dog is barking. But in this scenario, what can I control? How much time do I spend in this house while this dog is barking? What do I do to stop the dog from barking? Do I scream at him, or do I take him for a walk? Or do I, so I think sometimes we need a perspective shift to be able to see, oh, I'm not as stuck as I thought I was. And obviously that's a very tangible example, but there are emotional stressors as well that we tend to ruminate on. And I think the hardest part is finding them and teasing them out and figuring out what can we control and what can we not. Isn't that the Alcoholics Anonymous motto?
Oh yeah, what is that prayer?
It's like the serenity prayer. Yeah.
Thank you. Give me the strength to, yes, accept the things I cannot change. Yes.
But you could say for rest and digest, you could add serenity in there, peace, and we have to fight sometimes for it because things around us are trying to sabotage us. Another example I can think of is my radio broke in my car a couple years ago. And for 6 months, I drove to work for 15 minutes in silence and drove home in silence. And I realized that the silence was exactly what I needed, because when else would I have silence in my day, So it was an accident. But instead of being mad and paying to fix it really quickly, I realized, oh, the silence was exactly what I needed. So.
Awesome. Okay. And then one of the next questions when you were talking about eating and kind of in peace was, what about watching TV, comedy, or dramas while eating? So I think I know the answer here, but.
Yeah. So if you're doing anything while you eat, then all of these 20 different hormones, because I didn't talk about all of them, but all of these hormones that turn on and signal the brain to be full, to feel the stomach, to be hungry, to secrete more saliva, to crave certain types of foods, they're all not working. Now they're working, but like 1/10 of what we want them to work. So unfortunately, when we distract the brain when we're eating, we can override a lot of these hormones. And so, if I'm looking at my food and I'm craving more avocado, I can trust it. But if I'm watching the TV and I'm craving more fat, I don't know. Is that because the hormones didn't register? The hormones actually have to register, oh, she ate enough fat in this meal. Does that make sense? So it's not just satiety. It's also that there are specific brain hormones for specific combinations of foods like protein, carbohydrates, and fat. So unfortunately, if you are watching something or you want to watch something and you need more screen time and it's hard to decrease it, then an app like iFlux or something that dims your screen or blocks the blue light, glasses that block the blue light, that would be really helpful.
Awesome. And then one of the questions, which I think is really interesting, and maybe you just touch on it because I think we could talk about it for a while, is I don't think I have stress, but how can I confirm or deny that I have stress? And so you kind of said, with the resting heart rate, and this person responded that hers was a little bit over 70. So
yeah, let me answer that you have stress if you're alive, period. Because if you didn't have stress, you would have no cortisol and you would be dead. I'm serious. So stress can be positive, stress can be negative, stress can be neutral. But everybody has events that trigger these hormones. Yeah.
And so maybe when we think we don't have stress, we are either not tuned into it or we can deal with it really well. Maybe one of the two there, or.
Well, the question is, can you notice when there is an imbalance, right? Because this is kind of a Buddhist thing, but like, it's never going to be a perfect balance. There's going to be weeks that feel easier than other weeks. And the question is noticing when things get out of balance, because they're not going to stay perfectly in balance all the time. It's part of being human, unfortunately. Or maybe that's fortunate. I don't know. Yeah, the book. Oh, you know what? Let me go to the resources too. The book by Tara Brach called Radical Acceptance does help you, I think, notice if you have stress. Would you agree, Kelly?
Absolutely. It was kind of a game changer when I read that book.
Yeah. So these two books are really the only philosophical ones I put on the list. The others are more sciencey, more tangible. But the Biology of Belief and Radical Acceptance, both of those are huge when it comes to intentionally maybe noticing things and noticing what you have control over.
Love it. Okay, and then another similar question, and maybe it was explained, I don't know, but can you explain more about mindfulness? And so I kind of just wrote back, essentially just having your brain and body live in the same place at the same time, but I don't know if you want to quickly expand on that real quick.
Absolutely. I think the best example, when I first heard the term mindfulness, was around the time I actually had the ER visit for the low cortisol. And my friend said to me, she was a nurse, she said, I have a nurse friend who's doing mindfulness classes. Do you want to come? And I said, what do you mean mindfulness classes? What do you do? And she said, well, we sit there, she gives us a strawberry, and we take 10 minutes to eat the one strawberry. And I was like, this sounds horrible, Nancy. And she said, no, it's not, because when's the last time you actually looked at it, felt it, smelled it, tasted it? Like, and let's see, I don't know who's left on the call here, but I think in general, we are over-scheduled and over-committed people, some of us working moms, and it's just really hard to have a moment to sit down and look at the strawberry. So the point of the class was, this is something that's free that you can access at any moment. If you're able to just notice, what is your body doing? What is your brain doing? And that's all it is. And actually the book Radical Acceptance kind of helps build on that. Now that you notice what your breathing is doing, can you be kind in the way that you self-talk, right? So like, I just noticed I wasn't taking a deep breath, and here I am doing this talk on the adrenals. Well, before I take a deep breath, I could also stop judging myself, right? So it's also about the self-talk there that comes in, that we tend to have. I'm generalizing, but we tend to have that.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to jump around for a minute because I know we still have several questions. And okay.
Yeah, and I can email people answers too.
So one of the questions was, does LDN specifically help adrenals then, or just helps to calm the autoimmune response that helps the adrenals?
Yeah, we don't know how, but we know it specifically helps the adrenals as well. So I do have a couple people on it that have not been diagnosed with autoimmune disease, but we've seen it bring down their inflammation, either post-COVID or even without COVID. And they now can have the type of sleep where their cortisol comes down. So there's still research happening with LDN. And if you go to ldnresearchtrust.org, you'll see there's more articles there. Definitely more coming soon. Dr. Salibi, my mentor, is on the board for the Research Trust. And there's a lot more in the pipeline in terms of nervous system and LDN. But the bottom line is that the naltrexone is talking to the immune system and talking to the nervous system and the endocrine system. So it's like when you take it, the hormones in the brain are affecting those other systems. And that happens in the middle of the night, which is the time when we are supposed to be healing. But a lot of us are so depleted, we can't do that much healing overnight. So I think the LDN helps us get to a place where we can do more healing.
And then Willie just kind of wanted to remind, which I think is great, and I'm going to say it out loud, that green tea extract, specifically the compound EGCG, has amazing antiviral properties for HSV, for EBV, the viruses that we were talking about.
And it's hard to find, but I like this one. Yeah, it's hard to find, but I like this one by Vitanica. It's green tea extract. You can also drink green tea, but you have to drink 6 to 7 cups a day to get enough of the EGCG to be anti-inflammatory and antiviral. Yeah, and if you'd like a handout on Epstein-Barr or on viruses in general, on things that help, resveratrol is great too. Monolaurin is great, lauric acid. I don't want people to try everything all at once though. Number one, we don't know what's working. Right. And so what we're trying to do at the end of the visits and do a better job going forward is really tuning in to what we need right now, because you may need something in a few months. Like, for example, the green tea is great, but how do you know which one to start right now? And we'll talk more about that when we do our next workshop.
And then, so then the last couple of questions, one of them was how much vitamin D should we be getting each day? And I think that maybe it could just be best to have them reach out to you or Kristen individually and talk about their levels, because it is very dependent on, what's already going on in your system.
Yeah, vitamin D is fat soluble, which means you can overdose. So in general, people need pretty high doses right now during the winter, but you can also overdose. So it depends on how low your blood level is. So with vitamin D, I need to get a blood level.
And then someone just said, I just did 28 days of meditation and it was amazing. And I don't want to put them on the spot, but if they wanted to say just a minute of how that impacted their lives, because we know meditation does more than we sometimes think it will. I just wanted to say that, but certainly no pressure there. Or Kate, you can talk about what meditation did for you when you started if they don't want to talk. But
yeah, I mean, I got to be honest, and if they want to unmute, they can.
Totally happy about talking about meditation.
All right.
But me and my puppy, we have to take puppy breaks too.
Cuddles, you're getting your cuddles.
I am. I keep him in a playpen right next to me just for that. I actually set out to do this as an 28 days of straight exercise journey. So let me be very clear. And then I had a leak that caused me to move the Peloton across the wall, but I still wanted to be conscious about opening up that app and doing something every day. And so it shifted from working out every day to doing a meditation every day. And it was not my intent, but apparently it was kind of what I needed, because it was amazing. I did a ton of sleep meditations, a ton of calming meditations. Some were 5 minutes, some were 30 minutes. It kind of varied. But the point was I was taking a moment and just stopping and setting that time aside. And I am one of those busy, crazy working moms going into competition season with my daughter in dance. So I wasn't doing a great job with this. So I will tell you the meditations, you can find 1,000 on YouTube. Don't spend money on finding meditations. I will tell you that. But mine came through my Peloton app. I'm already a member. So yeah, it was amazing. The sleep was huge. I just recovered from COVID the month prior. So it was great timing as far as that went, to just kind of take that time and set aside. So yeah, food cravings definitely improved, I will say. So
awesome, Amber. I'm going to end the recording on that. I just